Hello, and welcome to Professor Morris's English class. The lesson for today is revising your essay. We should start by saying that revision, if done well, is a great deal of work, which is one reason why it's probably the most often neglected part of the writing process. So a student may rightly ask, why go through the trouble of revising a paper once it has already been written? One good reason is because a writer cannot assume that the first draft or even a couple of drafts communicate everything that needs to be said clearly and vividly for the reader. Revision also shows other people that you are a professional that take your work and your communication seriously. Revision also tells readers that you take them seriously by making sure that you have done all you can to clearly and best present your information. Another question is, what exactly is revision? Because oftentimes people have some misunderstandings about what it really means. And what does it require? Revision is to re-see what you're doing, hopefully in the eyes of a reader. When you write your first draft, you're writing from what is in your head. When you are revising, you are trying to make things clear for the person who is reading your information. It oftentimes means multiple drafts, each draft with a separate focus so that you can pay careful attention to those elements. It usually means significant development, rearranging, and pruning. Sometimes it means you need to add some material where you haven't shorn up your idea. Sometimes it means moving some things around. Oftentimes it means cutting things out. One of the most important things is it means asking very hard questions about your work and adjusting what you have written based on some very honest answers. Because revision is sometimes a very overwhelming task and can be fraught with lots of moving parts, the best way to approach a paper by revision is to use what we call a top-down approach. What that means is working with the biggest parts of the writing first and moving towards the smaller parts. You can think of it as looking at the essay as a whole and moving down to the smaller component parts of sentences. You may not be aware of it, but when you read something, your brain processes the information in three separate ways or three elements. We're going to look at two other ones in a moment, but mostly we're looking at these three. First is the content. That is the message, the main idea, and how that idea gets developed by the writer. And second is organization. Might seem obvious, the order things come, but we're also looking at the way the material is arranged in the big levels, like where if you have paragraphs in the best possible position, or even in the micro levels, like it's a small paragraph and sentences within that paragraph. Another way we process that information is through the element of language level writing, which we divide into two places. One is problems with grammar, punctuation, that's your errors that have to do with sentence fragments and run-on sentences and things like that, but also problems of style that may not be exactly errors, but they are not the best way to communicate what you're trying to say. This oftentimes includes redundancy or wordiness or vague information. Two other elements that are important are presentation and documentation. For students in an English class, this has to do with the formatting of your paper, whether you followed the guidelines or not. In a business, it could have to do with how you put together slides, for example, or any other media that is consistent and helpful for the readability and understanding of the material. Documentation is where you give a clear demonstration of where you've gotten information. Uh, this is usually left for when we do research papers, but it is important to adhere to the proper style. In our first or maybe even second revision, we want to ask hard questions about the content and organization of your paper. Does your essay have a central point for a specific audience? Sometimes the essay has 2 or 3 points it's trying to cover, but doesn't really cover any of them adequately. Sometimes students write for several pages about just the general topic, but not really having a point. Have you delivered what the thesis promises? One reason that your English teacher usually wants your thesis early in your paper is because it sets the stage for everything else. And if the body material doesn't really match what's in the thesis, you generally have a problem. What essential information is missing? Usually in first drafts, we have all our ideas there, but we haven't developed them with real precise information. What material is unnecessary or unclear? Sometimes we write a paragraph that seems related to the topic when we first draft, but then as we look at it, we don't see a connection. Sometimes that means cutting a paragraph out. Sometimes it means making it clearer by adding some material or reshaping the paragraph so that it connects more clearly to the material around it. Also, is your information arranged so that the ideas are clear and will impact your reader? Because oftentimes we write first drafts off the top of our head and put down material as we think of it, we might, for example, discuss a particular concept but not explain that concept till later in the paper, so we may have to move some things around. In the next stage of our revision process, we're going to take a close look at the individual paragraphs. And first, I want you to take a look at the body paragraphs before you talk about or look at the introduction and conclusion. So here are some hard questions for your individual paragraphs. Does each paragraph have one and only one central idea? Remember that sometimes we cover 2 or 3 topics in a single place and we need to divide the paragraph up. Do all the sentences in the paragraph support or develop that idea? What sentences need to be cut or placed elsewhere? Sometimes we throw in a sentence in the first or second draft that is on the topic, but really is about some other focus of your idea. This next question is really important, something I see a great deal of in student writing. What explanations, examples, or supporting details need to be added or made more specific? Oftentimes you need to explain a point a little bit more thoroughly or with more precise details. Sometimes you need examples to help your reader to see what you mean. Sometimes you need more details, literal details, so that the reader can see it. And oftentimes the details or the information needs to be more precise so that it is vivid and understandable for your reader. Because introductions and conclusions serve 2 different purposes than the body paragraphs, I want you to think about these questions when looking at your introduction. Does it give your reader an idea of where you're going? Usually your thesis is going to do this for you, but if it's just a general statement about the topic, that's probably not going to be very helpful. Part of the introduction's purpose is to gain the reader's interest. Remember that except for your teacher, the reader does not have to keep on reading, so you want to hook them in some way. In your conclusion, ask yourself whether there's a sense that the paper has come to a real end. I don't know how many times I've read an essay where there's good information and it just stops. Is your conclusion appropriate for your audience or your purpose? That is, if you have gone off in a different direction right at the end, that might be confusing for your reader. Do you end with a bang? Do you end with something that's memorable and helpful for your reader to remember the main ideas? Near the end of the revision process is when we look at the language level writing or the sentence level writing. This is a part where I think students want to jump to right ahead because the content and organization things, they take a lot more work and energy to fix. Sometimes errors seem like they're pretty easy, but there are a lot of things that get missed in this process. One of the best things you can do for yourself during this time is to read your paper out loud or have it read to you so you can hear it. Oftentimes you'll catch all sorts of mistakes and problems just by hearing it. You may not even remember the rule about why a sentence isn't right, but you will oftentimes just sense that it doesn't work the way it's supposed to, whether it has an actual error or is just long and convoluted. So ask yourself, what sentences are not clear or logically put together? If you're like me and you write the way you speak, you may write in long sentences that kind of go in different directions and need to be divided up or clarified. What words require explanation or substitution? Sometimes you need to use a better word for the one that you've chosen because it's not clear or vivid or precise. Sometimes you need to explain a word because it's being used in a way that the reader might not be familiar with. Where have you been wordy, repetitive, redundant, or vague? All of these stylistic problems really do get in the way of good communication, and that is your goal. If you have vague words where you need precise ones, if you use 12 words in a sentence where 7 would do a better job, you're going to have some problems. It may sound good in your ear, but it won't sound good when it's on the brain of your reader. What errors need to be fixed? That sounds like an easy job, but lots of times, especially if you've struggled with things like grammar or punctuation, you don't know where to start. You just want to fix them, and there's a good chance you've made the same mistakes for years and not known how to fix them. A good thing is to start with those that you make most often. You may see those come up in your first papers in another class, or you may go to a writing center and work with a tutor and see whether or not that, what errors that is, rather, that are getting in the way, the ones that seem to show up the most often. When you're aware of those errors, you don't think about the rest, and you can spend a good time looking at your paper to ferret out those mistakes. And even if you don't catch every one, you'll probably vastly improve your writing. If you work with a workshop group, a group of people that are in your class, so that you can help each other to improve the papers, you have to have a goal right away that you want to improve the writing. You don't want to make people feel bad. You don't want to falsely inflate their egos either. Your goal is to make whatever piece of writing in front of you better. It's not a good idea to ask your friends, family, or your significant other to help you with a paper unless they can be truly constructive without being harmful, and you are a good listener to any criticism. When you get work back from your teachers, try to learn from both your success and your mistakes. Lots of times students don't even read feedback because they see every mark as something that's going to be negative. And most things on a paper are something that needs correction or needs some work. But oftentimes there are things that go well. And when that happens, of course, you want to repeat them. If you think about the elements that were mentioned before, particularly content, organization, and sentence level writing, and you look at any notes on feedback that are there, you can divide those notes into one of those categories. Oftentimes when we see feedback on a paper, it just looks like a whole bunch of stuff written on the top of our hard work. But if you can move those into categories, I sometimes like to encourage people to use a chart for that, then you can see which things go where, and it's a lot easier to learn from those problems. Of course, it's good to utilize any resources that you have that will help improve your paper, especially afterwards. And that's one of the reasons you have feedback, is because it's important to learn from everything that you've done. But utilize resources like a writing center where you are. Apply everything that you learn on one project to any future work, even if it's for another class. Keep in mind that your job is to not just to compartmentalize every little project and never move on from that, but what you learn, good and bad, about your own writing in one circumstance can help you make the next project even better. If you would like more information, you can go back and look at Chapter 6 of The Active Writer. Remember, it takes work to get from the blank page to the work you can be proud of, but that work will pay off.